Thank you. I'm delighted and honored and humbled also to be here today and to welcome you to our panel. As Michelle said, we are hoping that our panel will stimulate some discussion, some dialogue about current challenges to human rights and how we might start to think about addressing some of those challenges. So I'll begin by just setting a little bit of context, and then I will introduce our two panelists. So as we know from the earlier panels, human rights laws in Canada came into place as a result of social activism and coalition building. We also know that the goals of this social activism were first to obtain legislation that would prohibit certain forms of discrimination, and then secondly, to improve the enforcement of that legislation. And once the statutes and the commission were in place, social activists continued to be involved in initiatives to extend the scope of the statutes and to improve their enforcement. In terms of the scope of protection, there are two areas really that are involved. First of all, the areas that are covered, and as we know, the first statutes focused on employment and facilities and services. The third main area to be added to human rights statutes, and it was added certainly in some contexts incrementally, is housing. Housing is an area in which there have been very few cases, but I wanted to mention two recent Ontario initiatives that provide some current illustrations of some of the kind of work that social activists did in the 40s and 50s to get our very first fair employment statutes. And the first of these is a publication of the Canadian Centre for Equality, Rights and Accommodation, which some of you may know by the acronym CERA. They released a report last July, which is called Sorry, It's Rented. And in this report, actually, they did some testing of the kind of testing that was done in the 40s and 50s to examine the experience of certain targeted categories of people, one of which is Black lone parents. So that's one initiative. The second one is a report of the Ontario Human Rights Commission, which was released last October. Actually, the Commission's policy on human rights and rental housing, which is Canada's first comprehensive examination of how to identify and eliminate barriers to housing. And this document as well also documents various forms of discrimination in housing, including race-based discrimination. And I know that Phil will have also some comments to make in his presentation about sort of the focus of human rights laws as one of the issues to think about. The second aspect of the scope of protection is the prohibited grounds of discrimination. And as we've heard, the first statutes focused on race and religion. There was no sex, there was no disability. So over the years, social activists worked to expand legislation to include more social categories as prohibited grounds of discrimination, including age, sex, family and marital status, disability, and sexual orientation. And most recently, there's been some research and debates about the possibility of adding social condition with the idea that might provide a door into using human rights laws to try to address social inequalities resulting from poverty. Now, we know also that the focus on prohibited grounds of discrimination has generated debates about identity politics. We also know that there has been a recognition over the years that people's experiences of discrimination are often complex and not in these silos. And so, for example, among feminist activists and scholars, there have been many challenges to the idea of women as a universal category, and a call to recognize that women's experiences are also affected by their race, whether or not they're a person with a disability, whether they're a lesbian, a religious minority woman, etc. So that's in terms of the scope of protection. The other area, of course, is the enforcement of human rights laws. And the model that was in place from the beginning, both in Ontario and across Canada, was a commission-led enforcement model in which the human rights commissions had a wide range of roles, including education, policy development, and also responsibility for dealing with the complaints that came from individuals and groups. And in that complaint processing role, the Commission would investigate, fact-find, try to help people resolve their issues, and if that wasn't possible, the Commission itself would decide whether or not the case would go to a formal legal hearing. This model, especially in relation to the complaint side of it, adopted a philosophy of voluntary resolution as being the preferred model. And I just would like to quote a passage written by Dr. Hill in a 1965 publication of the Ontario Human Rights Commission. And it reads, "Modern-day human rights legislation is predicated on the theory that the actions of prejudiced people and their attitudes can be changed and influenced by the process of re-education, discussion, and the presentation of socio-scientific materials that are used to challenge popular myths and stereotypes about people. Human rights on this continent is a skillful blending of educational and legal techniques in the pursuit of social justice." And this skillful blending has gone on, but has also been the subject of much debate, and a considerable part of social activism, certainly since the late 1980s, early 1990s, has focused on questions about this model of enforcement, at least in relation to complaints coming forward from individuals and groups. And we've had activists on one side of the debate supporting that commission-led model, but calling for it to be better resourced, and activists on the other side of the debate calling for a move to a different model in which individuals and groups can take their cases directly to a formal tribunal process. One's referred to as the commission gatekeeper model, the other the direct access model. And 2 provinces in Canada have in fact now moved away from the commission-led model to this direct access to a tribunal model, although in somewhat different ways. The 2 provinces are British Columbia and Ontario. British Columbia in fact simply got rid of their Human Rights Commission entirely, and so all that's left there is this tribunal formal legal process. Ontario, we still do have the Human Rights Commission with its role of policy developer, educator, and also the ability to participate in cases before the tribunal. Finally, I just wanted to say a few things about the labor movement, which Marie will be talking about in much more detail. But just to say, just as the labor movement was very much involved in human rights social activism in the 1940s and 50s, it has continued to be actively engaged with human rights and has also been challenged by human rights. Trade unions and labor organizations have always placed considerable emphasis on the need for human rights education, but they have also contributed significantly to the development of human rights jurisprudence by pursuing legal remedies for human rights claims through the grievance arbitration processes under collective agreements. So it is now my pleasure to introduce our 2 panelists, and I will introduce them in the order in which they will be speaking. First, to my far left, Phil Fraser, who has enjoyed a long and varied career, which has included broadcasting, education, and public service, and has engaged with human rights issues from a number of perspectives. Phil began his career as a radio announcer and eventually became program manager and senior producer of Mita, Alberta, Canada's first on-air educational television station, which later became Access TV. He later hosted and produced a weekly public affairs program in Edmonton and was among the pioneers in building a Western Canadian film industry. He organized the first Alberta Film Festival and founded the Banff International Television Festival. Phil was a member of the Alberta Task Force on Film and the Federal Task Force on Broadcasting Policy. He was the governor of the Canadian Journalism Foundation, as well as a founding member of the Academy of Canadian Cinema. And as mentioned earlier, he was president and CEO of Vision TV for 5 years. Phil was appointed to the Canadian Multiculturalism Council in 1987, and then served a 3-year term as Chief Commissioner for the Alberta Human Rights Commission from 1989 to 1992. He was a member of the Citizens Forum on Canada's Future and he has served on numerous boards of directors, including Telefilm Canada, CBC News World Ottawa, the John Humphrey Centre for Peace and Human Rights, and the Ontario Heritage Foundation. His numerous awards and honors include membership in the Order of Canada, the John Ware Memorial Award for Lifetime Achievement presented by the Black Achievement Award Society of Alberta, the Harry Jerome Award for Excellence in the Professions presented by the Black Business and Professional Association in Toronto, and an honorary doctorate from the University of Alberta. As an educator, Phil developed and for many years taught a course on the evolution of human rights to third-year students in the Faculty of Law of the University of Alberta. He is currently an adjunct professor of communications at Athabasca University, as well as community co-chair of the Michael Jean Chair in Canadian, Caribbean, and African Diasporic Studies at the University of Alberta. Phil's a member of the Canadian Association of Black Journalists, and his columns on human rights and multiculturalism have appeared in the Toronto Star, as well as a number of other papers. He published a memoir on Canadian multiculturalism called Black Like Me, published in the 100th anniversary issue of Saturday Night Magazine. He has written a biography of Harry Jerome, which is soon to be a feature documentary produced by the National Film Board. His most recent book, titled How the Blacks Created Canada, is a history of the Black experience in Canada, which is available here today at the Ontario Black History Society table in our other room. And he is currently working on two other books, a biography of Toronto radio mogul Denham Jolly, and a novel built around Black immigration to BC in the 1850s. Second to my left is Marie Clark Walker, who is currently an Executive Vice President of the Canadian Labour Congress. She is both the first woman of color to be elected as an Executive Vice President of the CLC, as well as the youngest ever elected CLC officer. Marie's career has been devoted to social justice and community justice. She has worked on youth reconstruction programs in Grenada and has worked in Toronto in a home for the aged, with adults and children with developmental disabilities, and as a counselor and family support worker. Marie's own experiences of workplace racism led her to develop a peer mediation anti-racism program for use in elementary schools, and also led to a renewed union activism. She rose rapidly through the ranks of the Canadian Union of Public Employees, eventually becoming QP Ontario's Equity Vice President and the union's first ever National Diversity Vice President before first being elected as CLC Executive VP in 2002. Marie has been deeply involved with a wide range of social justice, community, and equity work, including struggles for women's rights and equality. In her previous roles at the CLC, she has been responsible for the poverty, housing, health, safety and environment, and peace files, as well as the Women and Human Rights Department, and for transportation, aviation, and security issues. As the CLC representative on the broadly based Pay Equity Task Force, she was part of ongoing efforts to have the federal government appreciate both the social and the economic issues implicit in equal pay for work of equal value. In her current work at the CLC, Marie is heading up a unique pilot project in Toronto by connecting the labor movement in Canada's largest and most diverse city with the community. She's also working with the Ontario Federation of Labour and Metro Toronto Area Labour Councils to help build Labour's profile, increase public support, and improve links with community groups and social allies. As a community activist, Marie has served as a board member on a number of organizations, including the Canadian Peace Alliance and the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives. She is currently a governor on the Canadian Centre for Occupational Health and Safety, and is an executive member of the Coalition of Black Trade Unionists, Juliet's Place, a shelter for abused women, and the Malvern Community Coalition. And last but not least, a term which was new to me, Marie acts as a femtor, a female mentor for many young people. So with that, I'll turn it over to you.